The rain hammered down like nails on a coffin lid. I stood in the doorway of Thorne Sons Boatyard, soaked to the bone, chest heaving, as lightning split the Oregon sky in half. My fingers crushed the edges of the legal notice I'd just been handed. The ink was already bleeding from the rain, but the words burned anyway. 48 hours. That was all it took for my entire life to be ripped away. Inside the workshop, under the harsh glow of old hanging bulbs, my father, Rafferty Crowe, sat at the long oak table that had belonged to my grandfather. His new wife, Elowen, stood beside him like a shadow that had learned how to smile. And there, on the other side of the table, was my half-sister Lyra, barely 19, looking small and uncomfortable in the chair that used to be mine. Rafferty's pen moved across the paper with a soft, final scratch. I stepped forward. My boots left dark, wet prints on the worn wooden floor. The smell of cedar, linseed oil, and salt air, the smell of my childhood, suddenly felt like it was choking me. "Dad," my voice cracked despite how hard I tried to keep it steady. "What the hell are you doing?" He didn't even look up at first, just finished signing, then slowly capped the pen like he had all the time in the world. When he finally lifted his eyes, they were cold, calm, the same eyes that once told me bedtime stories about the sea. "Signing what should have been done years ago, Caspian." Elowen placed a perfectly manicured hand on his shoulder. Her diamond ring caught the light, new, expensive, nothing like the simple band my mother used to wear. Rafferty slid the documents across the table toward me. "Effective immediately, you no longer hold any ownership in Thorne Sons. The majority shares have been transferred to Elowen and Lyra. You're out." The words hit me like a breaker wave. Out. Just like that. I stared at the signature, his bold, confident scrawl, and felt something inside my chest crack wide open. "This yard, this business, Grandpa left it to me too," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the rain roaring on the metal roof. "He made it clear in the will. You know that." Rafferty leaned back in the chair, the same chair my grandfather had sat in for 40 years. "Your grandfather was sentimental. I'm not. You had your chance, son. That accident 5 years ago, the one where you nearly killed 2 people because you were showing off, proved you don't have what it takes. Blood doesn't make you worthy. Results do." His voice dropped lower, colder. "Sometimes, Caspian, even blood has to know its place." The thunder outside rolled so deep it vibrated in my ribs. I felt my hands start to shake, not from the cold, from pure, burning rage mixed with a grief so sharp it cut straight through me. This was the man who taught me how to tie my first knot, who carried me on his shoulders when I was 5 and scared of the waves. Now he was looking at me like I was nothing more than a mistake that had finally overstayed its welcome. Lyra wouldn't meet my eyes. She kept staring at her hands, twisting them in her lap like she wanted to disappear. Elowen just smiled, that small, satisfied smile, the kind that said she had won. I took one step closer, the legal paper still dripping in my fist. "You're really doing this? In the middle of the night? While I'm standing right here?" Rafferty stood up slowly. For the first time, I noticed how much older he looked. Or maybe I just never wanted to see it before. "Pack your things by morning. The locks will be changed after that." He turned and walked toward the back office without another word. Elowen followed, but not before giving me one last pitying glance. I stood there alone in the middle of the workshop I had loved my entire life. The half-finished hull of a sailboat loomed behind me like a skeleton. Tools hung silently on the walls, tools I had used since I was 12. Every beam, every plank, every scar on the floor carried memories of my grandfather's laugh, my father's proud nods, my own dreams of one day running this place the right way. Now it was gone, all of it, stolen by the one man I had trusted most in this world. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't need to look to know it was Maeve again. She had been texting nonstop since yesterday, worried because I wasn't answering. Sweet, steady Maeve, the only person who still believed I was worth something. But right now, I couldn't even bring myself to reply. I looked down at the soaked legal notice in my hands. The words blurred, but the pain didn't. This wasn't just losing a business. This was losing my home, my history, my last connection to the man I used to call Dad. And the worst part? Deep down, a small, terrified voice inside me wondered if he was right. Maybe I really wasn't worthy. The rain kept falling harder, drumming against the roof like 1,000 angry fists. I didn't move. I couldn't. Because in that moment, standing in the ruins of everything I thought I knew, I realized something that chilled me deeper than the storm outside. My own father had just thrown me overboard, and he didn't even bother to watch me drown. I left Thorne Sons that same night. No shouting, no dramatic scene, just the sound of my old truck's engine coughing to life in the pouring rain, and the sight of the workshop lights slowly shrinking in my rearview mirror until they disappeared completely. One suitcase. That was all I took. Everything else, tools I'd used since I was a boy, photos on the walls, the half-built skiff I'd been working on for 6 months, stayed behind like ghosts I wasn't allowed to claim anymore. Maeve Solace had texted me the address of a small rental cottage 20 miles down the coast. She didn't ask questions when I showed up at her door at 2 a.m., drenched and shaking. She just opened her arms, let me collapse against her for a long minute, then drove me the rest of the way in silence. The cottage was tiny. Weathered cedar shingles, 1 bedroom, a narrow porch facing the Pacific. The kind of place people go when they want to disappear for a while. For the first 3 days, I barely left the bed. I lay there staring at the ceiling while the waves crashed outside, each roar reminding me of the life I no longer had. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's face, calm, certain, signing away my future like it was just another contract. The memory played on repeat, the scratch of the pen, the cold way he said, "Sometimes blood has to know its place." How do you breathe when the man who raised you looks at you like you're disposable? On the 4th night, Maeve brought over a box, old family documents, tax records, letters from my grandfather. She had driven back to the boatyard herself during the day, sweet-talked one of the old workers into letting her take some things for safekeeping. She didn't say much when she handed it to me, just squeezed my shoulder and whispered, "You don't have to look tonight, but when you're ready, the truth might be in here." I waited until she left. Then I sat at the small kitchen table under a single hanging bulb and started reading. At first it was just pain. Bank statements showing large withdrawals that didn't match any boat orders. Signatures that looked like mine but weren't. Slight differences in the loops of the letters that only someone who knew my handwriting would notice. Emails between Rafferty and Elowen discussing how to handle the boy like I was a problem that needed managing. But the worst part came when I found the documents involving Lyra. My half-sister had been listed as a co-signer on several key transfers. She was only 19, barely old enough to understand what she was putting her name on. Yet there it was, her shaky signature next to Rafferty's bold one. They had used her, positioned her as the young voice of the new generation to make the takeover look legitimate. I felt sick. Lyra wasn't the enemy. She was just another pawn on my father's chessboard. A quiet, nervous girl who had always tried so hard to earn his approval. Now she was being paraded as proof that the Crowe family was moving forward without me. The more I read, the heavier the air in the cottage felt. It was like discovering the hull of a beloved ship had been rotting from the inside for years. Eaten away by a poisoned tide no one on deck had noticed until it was too late. I started questioning everything. Had I really been that blind? Had my mistake 5 years ago given him the perfect excuse he'd been waiting for? Or had he been planning this all along, slowly positioning pieces while smiling at me across the dinner table? The anger came in waves, hot, then ice cold. One moment I wanted to drive back and burn the whole yard down. The next, I felt nothing but a deep, crushing exhaustion. I kept thinking about my mother, gone too early, and how she used to say Rafferty had a good heart buried under ambition. I wondered what she would think if she could see what that ambition had become. Maeve checked on me every evening. She never pushed. She'd sit on the porch with me, wrapped in a blanket, listening while I spoke in broken sentences. Sometimes I cried. Sometimes I just stared at the ocean and said nothing. She never told me to move on. She just reminded me, quietly, that I was still here, still breathing. One night, she brought Attorney Seraphine Locke with her. Seraphine was sharp-eyed, soft-spoken, and carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who had seen too many powerful men try to rewrite history. She didn't offer false hope. She simply spread the documents across the table and said, "This isn't clean, Caspian. There are patterns here, inconsistencies. If you want to fight, we'll need more, but the door isn't completely closed yet." For the first time since that night in the workshop, I felt something besides despair. Not hope exactly, just the faintest spark of resolve. Still, the nights were the hardest. I would wake up gasping, covered in sweat, the sound of my father's voice echoing in my head. "You don't have what it takes." Every morning I looked in the mirror and wondered if he was right. The man staring back at me looked hollow, lost, like a boat cut loose from its mooring with no sail and no anchor. Yet somewhere beneath the grief and self-doubt, a quiet decision was forming. I wouldn't let this end with me walking away broken. I would understand exactly what they had done, and then I would decide what came next. On a gray Thursday afternoon, while I was sorting through another stack of old ledgers, my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A deep, steady voice came through the line. "Mr. Thorne, this is Detective Soren Vale, Oregon State Police, White Collar Crimes Division." I froze, the papers still in my hands. "I've been looking into the recent ownership transfer at Thorne Sons Boatyard. There are some irregularities I'd like to discuss with you. Off the record, for now." The wind outside picked up, whistling low around the corners of the cottage. I closed my eyes for a second, heart hammering against my ribs. Finally, I answered, my voice rough from days of silence. "I'm listening, Detective." Months blurred together like fog rolling off the Pacific. Some days I still woke up reaching for the familiar weight of my old work boots, only to remember they were back at the boatyard, along with everything else that used to define me. The cottage no longer felt like a temporary shelter. It had become a quiet battlefield where I fought the version of myself that wanted to stay broken. But something was shifting. Slowly. Painfully. I started waking up before dawn again. Not because I had somewhere to be, but because lying in bed with my thoughts had become heavier than facing them. Attorney Seraphine Locke came by twice a week, her briefcase always neat, her questions always precise. She never rushed me. She simply spread documents across the kitchen table and helped me see the patterns I had missed in my grief. Piece by piece, we built a case. Not loud, not angry, just facts. Dates, inconsistencies in signatures, transfers that made no sense unless someone had been deliberately hiding money. Seraphine's calm voice became a strange kind of anchor. "You're not just collecting evidence, Caspian," she told me one rainy afternoon. "You're building a foundation strong enough to hold the truth." While the legal work moved forward in silence, I turned back to what I knew best: wood, lines, and the sea. In the small shed behind the cottage, I began designing again. Not another traditional fishing boat like the ones my grandfather built. This time I poured everything I had into something new. A hybrid sailing vessel that combined old-world craftsmanship with modern efficiency. Light, strong, beautiful in its simplicity. I worked late into the nights, hands raw from sanding, mind finally quiet when it had something useful to do. The project gave me more than purpose. It gave me back a piece of my pride. Local papers started noticing. A small article appeared online. Thorne's son returns to the water with radical new design. The headline made my stomach twist. They still called me Thorne's son, as if that name still belonged to me. Maeve was there through all of it. She never pushed me to talk about revenge. Instead, she sat with me on the porch while I sketched hull lines by lantern light. One evening, as the sun dipped into the ocean like molten copper, she spoke softly. Revenge isn't about burning their boat, Caspian. It's about building one so strong that their storm can't sink you. Her words stayed with me long after she left. They felt true and terrifying, because part of me still wanted to see my father lose everything the way I had. Another part, the part that remembered being a little boy on his shoulders, feared becoming the kind of man who destroys his own blood. The conflict lived in my chest like a constant low tide, pulling in two directions at once. Then came the message I didn't expect. It arrived late one night on a burner app. No name, just a short text. I know what they did. I'm sorry. Lyra. My hands trembled as I read it again. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying with a single question mark. She answered after 20 agonizing minutes. They told me it was just paperwork, that you didn't want the business anymore. I believed them, until I saw the way Dad looked at the documents. Like he'd been planning it for years. I have copies of things they didn't show you, if you still want them. I sat on the edge of the bed, heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. This was my little sister, the girl who used to follow me around the boatyard asking 1,000 questions. Now she sounded scared, guilty, lost. I typed back slowly, choosing every word with care. I don't want to destroy you, Lyra, but I need the truth. All of it. We began exchanging small pieces of information. Never over the phone, never in person. Just quiet drops of evidence that filled the gaps in Seraphine's file. Each new document felt like another crack in the hull of the life my father had built on lies. Lyra's messages carried a heavy shame. She kept saying she didn't know how deep it went, that she had only wanted to make him proud. I understood that feeling too well. Some nights the weight of it all still crushed me. I would stand on the porch listening to the waves and wonder if I was any better than him, planning in the shadows, using my own sister's guilt as leverage. But then I remembered the cold look in his eyes that night in the workshop, and the fire inside me steadied again. Not hatred, not yet. Just a quiet, burning determination. The hybrid boat design was nearly finished. I had even started building a scale model in the shed. When a local marine magazine reached out for an interview, I almost said no. The idea of my name appearing in public again made my stomach turn, but Seraphine advised me to accept. Visibility is protection, she said. The more eyes on you, the harder it becomes for them to rewrite the story. So I did the interview. I spoke carefully, not about the family fight, not about betrayal, just about the boat. About honoring the old ways while moving forward, about resilience. When the article came out, it was gentler than I expected. Caspian Thorne quietly rebuilding on the Oregon coast. A single line near the end mentioned that I was no longer affiliated with Thorne Sons. That line hurt more than I wanted to admit. Still, something had changed inside me. The despair that once felt like an anchor around my neck had become something else. A hidden current, steady and deep, carrying me forward whether I was ready or not. I wasn't the same man who had driven away in the rain that night. I was quieter, more careful, but I was no longer drowning. And somewhere in the distance, I could feel the tide beginning to turn. Then one crisp morning, as I stood sanding the hull of the scale model, my phone rang again. It was Detective Soren Vale. His voice was even, professional, but there was a new edge to it. Mr. Thorne, we need to talk. In person this time. Some of the documents you provided. They've opened doors I didn't expect. Are you ready for what comes next? I looked out at the ocean, the early light glinting off the waves like shattered glass. I took a slow breath. Yes, detective, I said quietly. I'm ready. The tide doesn't ask permission before it turns. It simply begins to pull in the opposite direction, slow at first, then unstoppable. I filed the lawsuit on a cold Tuesday morning in early spring. Attorney Seraphine Locke sat beside me in the federal courthouse hallway, her pen tapping lightly against the thick folder in her lap. When I signed the final page, my hand didn't shake. Not anymore. The complaint was clear and merciless in its simplicity. Fraud in the transfer of assets, forged signatures, undue influence, and deliberate concealment of my grandfather's intentions. Rafferty Crowe and Elowen Crowe were named as defendants. The words looked almost too clean on the paper, like they couldn't possibly carry the weight of everything they represented. But they did. While the legal machine began to move in its quiet, grinding way, something else happened that no one saw coming. My hybrid sailing design, the one I had poured months of sleepless nights into, won the Grand Innovation Award at the International Wooden Boat Show in Seattle. The news hit like a sudden gust of wind. Local papers, then national marine magazines, then online investors started calling. Photos of the sleek hull appeared everywhere, captioned with phrases like, "A new voice from the Oregon coast," and "Thorne's son redefines tradition." I stood on the small stage accepting the award, the weight of the glass trophy heavy in my hands, and for one brief moment I felt my father's eyes on me, even though he wasn't in the room. Back at the cottage that night, Maeve poured 2 glasses of wine and didn't say much. She just watched me with that quiet understanding she always carried. "They're seeing your name everywhere now," she said softly, "and they can't control it." She was right. Rafferty and Elowen began to unravel. Detective Soren Vale told me in a late-night call that they had started making frantic phone calls to lawyers, trying to shift assets, trying to spin the story. I could almost picture my father pacing the same workshop floor where he had once signed me away, his face tight with the kind of panic he had never allowed himself to show me before. The hidden current was becoming a visible wave. The preliminary hearing arrived faster than I expected. I walked into the courtroom wearing the only good suit I still owned. The air felt thick, heavy with the scent of polished wood and old paper. When Rafferty entered with Elowen beside him, our eyes met for the first time since that stormy night in the boatyard. He looked older, sharper lines around his mouth. His usual confident posture seemed slightly off balance, like a boat riding an unfamiliar swell. I didn't smile. I didn't glare. I simply held his gaze until he looked away first. Lyra was already seated on our side of the room. She had made her choice 2 weeks earlier in a whispered phone call that left her crying on the other end. "I can't keep carrying this," she had said. "Not when I know what they did to you." Today she would testify as a witness for my side, and the fear in her young face was unmistakable. Seraphine began methodically. Document after document, expert analysis of signatures, bank records that showed transfers timed suspiciously close to my grandfather's declining health. Each piece laid bare like layers of rotten wood being stripped away. Rafferty's lawyer tried to push back, but the evidence was patient and relentless. Then came Lyra's turn. She walked to the stand with trembling hands. Her voice started small, almost too quiet for the room, but as she spoke, it grew steadier. "I thought I was helping the family," she said, eyes fixed on the floor. "Dad told me Caspian didn't want the business anymore, that he was moving on. I believed him. But later, I saw the original will. I saw the emails. I realized I had signed away something that was never meant to be mine." She looked toward me for the first time, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm sorry, Caspian. I should have asked you myself." The courtroom was completely silent except for the soft scratch of the court reporter's keys. I felt something tight in my chest finally begin to loosen. Rafferty stared straight ahead, jaw clenched so hard the muscle jumped. Elowen's perfectly composed face had cracked. Her fingers twisted a handkerchief until the fabric threatened to tear. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my voice even. "I didn't come here to destroy my father," I said slowly. "I came here because the only thing worse than losing the boatyard was losing the truth of who I am." I looked directly at Rafferty. "You taught me that blood doesn't make someone worthy. Today I finally believe you." The words hung in the air like salt on the wind. No shouting, no dramatic breakdown, just the quiet, devastating weight of truth settling over the room, layer by layer. By the time the judge called a recess, the tide had clearly turned. Rafferty and Elowen left the courtroom surrounded by their lawyers, heads down, the confidence they once wore like armor now hanging in tatters. I stepped outside into the pale afternoon light and stood for a long moment on the courthouse steps. Maeve waited at the bottom, her coat pulled tight against the coastal breeze. When she saw me, she didn't rush forward. She simply nodded once, a small, proud smile touching her lips. In that moment, I understood something deep and final. The strongest revenge wasn't watching my father fall. It was standing tall on my own 2 feet while the world finally saw that I never needed his permission to sail. The hidden current had become a turning tide, and for the first time in nearly a year, I wasn't afraid of where it might carry me. The courtroom was quieter than I expected on the day the verdict came down. Judge Isolde Wren sat high on the bench, her voice steady and measured as she read the ruling. Every word felt like a wave finally reaching the shore after a long journey. The court declared the entire transfer of ownership null and void. All documents signed that stormy night were invalidated. Rafferty and Elowen were ordered to return control of Thorne and Sons and pay significant damages for the financial harm they had caused. I sat motionless, listening. No cheering, no dramatic outburst, just the soft rustle of papers and the distant sound of seagulls outside the windows. Rafferty stared straight ahead, his face pale and hollow. For the first time in my life, he looked small. Elowen's usual composure had completely shattered. She kept dabbing her eyes with a tissue, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. Detective Soren Vale sat in the back row, giving me a single respectful nod as the session ended. His investigation had closed with clear findings of fraud. Justice, in its slow and deliberate way, had finally arrived. I walked out of the courthouse into the sharp Oregon sunlight and felt, not triumph exactly, something gentler, something heavier, relief mixed with sorrow. Weeks later, I stood once more inside the boatyard that had defined my entire life. The familiar smell of cedar and salt air wrapped around me like an old coat. But this time I wasn't there to reclaim the past. I had made a different choice. I restructured the entire business into a cooperative. Workers who had been with my grandfather for decades now held shares. Young apprentices were given real training programs. And in a quiet corner of the new agreement, I carved out a small but meaningful role for Lyra. She came to the boatyard on a foggy morning to sign the papers. Her hands still trembled slightly as she held the pen. "I don't deserve this," she whispered, eyes downcast. I looked at my little sister, the girl who had once followed me around these same floors asking endless questions, and felt the old wound ache. "You don't have to deserve it, Lyra," I said gently, "but you can earn it, day by day, the same way the rest of us do." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. For the first time since everything fell apart, I saw a flicker of real hope in her eyes. Not the desperate kind she once wore trying to please our father, but something quieter, something real. Maeve stood beside me through every step of the transition. She never asked for credit. She simply showed up, with coffee on hard mornings, with silence on the nights when memories weighed too heavy, and with steady love on the days when I finally allowed myself to feel something other than anger. One evening, as we walked along the rocky beach near the cottage, she slipped her hand into mine. "You're building something new," she said softly. "Not just boats, but a life that no one can take away from you again." Her words settled deep in my chest. Months passed. The first boat built entirely under the new cooperative, the hybrid design I had poured my broken heart into, was finally launched. I stood on its deck as it cut smoothly through the water, the sails catching the wind with a sound like freedom. The hull gleamed under the late afternoon sun. Every line, every joint, every carefully chosen piece of wood carried the memory of pain, but also the strength that came after. I looked out across the vast Pacific, the water stretching endlessly toward the horizon. After the greatest storm, the sea always grows calmer than before, but the boats that survive are never the same. They are stronger, truer, built with wood that has learned how to bend instead of break. That was what I had become. Not the angry young man who had driven away in the rain. Not the broken son who once questioned his own worth. I was someone new, someone who understood that real legacy isn't written in wood or sealed in legal papers. It lives in the choices we make when everything is taken from us. It lives in the quiet decision to offer a second chance to a scared young sister. It lives in the patient love of a woman who stayed when the storm was at its worst. It lives in the strength to rebuild without becoming bitter. Rafferty never reached out. I didn't expect him to. Some bridges burned too completely to ever cross again. And I had learned that was okay. Family by blood can wound you deeper than anyone else, but family isn't only blood. Real family is the people who choose to stand beside you when the keel is shattered and the sails are torn. Real family is Maeve's quiet presence. It's Lyra's hesitant but honest effort. It's the old workers who stayed loyal not because of a name, but because of the work itself. As the boat moved gracefully across the water, I placed my hand on the smooth rail and whispered a silent thank you to my grandfather. Not for the boatyard he left behind, but for the values he planted in me that somehow survived the storm. The sea stretched before me, calm and endless. I no longer feared its depths, because I had finally learned the hardest, most important truth. Betrayal from those closest to you may break you for a while, but it does not get to define who you become. The strongest revenge is not destruction. It is rising anyway, and sailing forward on a boat you built with your own two hands, honest, resilient, and finally, truly yours. This story leaves us with a powerful reminder. When family betrays you, when everything you trusted is taken away, true victory comes not from revenge, but from the courage to rebuild yourself stronger, kinder, and wiser than before. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening and for allowing this story to speak to your heart. The Wild West still holds countless truths, some painful, some tender, all worth remembering. Stay with us. Subscribe, comment, and invite others to discover these untamed stories. From our hearts to yours, thank you for being part of this journey. Aviso legal. Disclaimer: each story shared here is produced for storytelling enjoyment. Certain scenes may include fictional or dramatized elements inspired by historical circumstances. Although AI tools assist us in visuals, narration, and script development, the emotional tone, editing, and quality control are conducted by people to ensure meaningful experiences. We fully uphold YouTube's policies, using no deceptive recreations or impersonations of real individuals. All creative resources are properly licensed. Unauthorized copying, re-uploading, or remixing is not permitted. Thank you for supporting the effort behind every episode we create.